Before we begin, of course, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting today on the lands of First Nations peoples. I'm at UTS, so I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay particular respect to the Gadigal as the traditional custodians of knowledge for the land upon which this university is built. I also want to extend my respect to the traditional owners of the country where you are joining us from, and pay respect to their elders. My name's Verity Firth. I'm the Executive Director of Social Justice here at UTS, and I head up our Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion. It's my real pleasure to be hosting today's event, and we're putting this on in partnership with the Human Rights Law Centre. So I'll be introducing you to Hugh Kretser in a minute, but we really enjoy this partnership we have with the Human Rights Law Centre. We have some fantastic guests, Dr. Leanne Holt, Jane Hunt, Chris Ronan and Hugh Kretser, and I'll have a chance to properly introduce them in a minute. So today's event is about education, and the data is clear that education is not the great equaliser it was once thought to be. Currently, the best predictors of a young person's educational aspirations and success is their postcode and their family's socio-economic circumstances. The educational divides are widening in Australia across many lines for First Nations communities, for students in rural and remote areas compared to their metropolitan peers, for children from migrant backgrounds, and for those without access to digital resources. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by a distinguished panel, each working to resolve the inequities in our system, from early childhood all the way through to higher education. Do families and children have a right to quality, equitable education? What can we do to ensure that every student is on an equal playing field? So I'm now going to introduce everyone to our speakers, and I'm going to start with Dr. Leanne Holt. Dr. Leanne Holt is a Worimi Biripi woman with over 25 years of experience in the higher education sector. She is the inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Strategy at Macquarie University, and on the advisory board for the newly established Centre for Global Indigenous Futures. Dr. Holt is the immediate past president of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Higher Education Consortium and serves on a range of community and professional local, national and international boards and expert panels. She recently launched a book, Talking Strong, which tracks the development of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education policy in Australia. The book records the voices of those Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders that worked with communities, governments and education providers to map a path for the positive educational future of Indigenous peoples. So welcome, Leanne, and thank you for joining us. Jane Hunt is the founding CEO of the Front Project, which is an independent national organisation addressing disadvantage and improving outcomes for children, families and society by realising the benefits of quality early learning. Jane is an innovative and results-driven social change leader who has dedicated her career to empowering people to improve the world. She is steering Australian business, government and community leaders to place a new value on children in the early years. This work combines her passion for children's education, health and development, and her commitment to empowering leaders to make change for the better. Welcome, Jane. Chris Ronan is the Equity and Engagement Director for the Country University Centre, and he's worked in higher education and not-for-profit sectors across the United States, New Zealand and Australia. He is the President and Advocacy Director of the Society for the Provision of Education in Rural Australia. Welcome, Chris. And last but not least, Hugh Kretser has been with the Human Rights Law Centre since it was established in 2006, starting as a board member before becoming its Executive Director in 2013. Under his leadership, the Centre has continued to extend its positive impact on human rights in Australia. The Human Rights Law Centre is currently building the public campaign to create an Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms to help level the playing field for individuals and communities and ensure that the decisions and actions of our government are guided by the values of freedom, equality, compassion and dignity. Welcome, Hugh. So I'm going to open with a question to all of you, and we might just go around and each of you can have a response. I'll start with you, Hugh. Now, the question is, some think that if you're smart enough and hardworking enough, then there's no barrier for you to receive the education that fits your skills and abilities. Is that true? Hugh?
Of course, it's not true. People who have, so people in Australia and like countries can make it to the top, but there is this myth of an egalitarian Australia. We are divided on many different grounds. We have intersecting levels of disadvantage from regions, postcode, poverty, race, social status, gender, and so on. And so when we look at our health system, our housing, and our education systems, that inequality persists. And so it's been well documented. We have the Closing the Gap agreement that I'm sure Leanne and others will talk about in terms of trying to bridge the gap in educational disadvantage. Chris, I'm sure we'll talk about the postcode disadvantage experienced by people in rural areas, and then there's poverty and other disadvantage as well. So we absolutely need to do more to make sure we have much greater equality in our educational systems in this country.
Jane, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, quite a lot to add. The question reminded me that we just love that myth of the heroic individual who's smart enough and able enough to navigate things, but there's a reason that's a myth, or at best a kind of exception, if you like, because it really doesn't hold true for children in their early years. I mean, the evidence is very clear that in Australia, we have children growing up who do not have the conditions that enable them to develop those foundational skills and abilities that they need to set them up for learning. And we know this because we measure it through the Australian Early Development Census, the AEDC. And what we have found through the measurement of that, it's measurement of core skills and abilities, things like, emotional maturity, language, social competence, etc. But what we find is that every year about 60,000 children are assessed as developmentally vulnerable as they start school. And that has a profound lifelong effect. So by grade 3, those children are generally a year behind their peers on that plan. By grade 5, they're 2 years behind their peers. And those children are most or least likely to finish school and therefore go on and get employment and so on. But we know that early childhood education is a powerful mechanism to reduce that developmental vulnerability. Parents know it. 81% of our families and community members say we need high quality early childhood education and care for children, but there are things that get in the way of that. And so families say that if they live outside of the city, they have very constrained choice. They have little or no choice about accessing early childhood education and care. The further you move away from the city, the more likely you're going to be at risk of developmental vulnerability. Nearly half of the children in remote areas and nearly a quarter of those in regional are assessed as developmentally vulnerable. And then the other factor that's a real barrier for early childhood education is cost or affordability. 80% of families say it's an issue for them, whether they're accessing through childcare or kinder. I mean, kinder alone is around $2,000 a year, which is prohibitive for some families. If you're accessing it through childcare, then you have to be working or assessed as having an activity. And so we know that there are barriers, absolutely, for children's access. But I think there's something else we forget. I used to work with families, particularly women who are wanting to go on and get work. So they've come from, really vulnerable situations. And for them, all of their being was focused on alleviating scarcity. So if it was food or housing or stability of relationships and so on. And when you're trying to alleviate scarcity, your bandwidth is constrained. That is what you're focused on. And that holds true for children as well. It's really hard to learn if you are hungry. You don't get the nutrition that you need to learn, but everything will be focused on getting food and not being able to develop those building blocks for learning.
That's amazing. Chris?
Thanks, Verity. I just want to pick up on what Jane was saying a little bit around the narrative of the hero and that notion of overcoming adversity. So I think in education, those narratives feed the premise of your question that, if you're smart enough and work hard enough, then there is no barrier. And the knock-on effect of that is we see, look at person X who's been able to do this. Why can't you do that? And it embeds the notion that if someone can't overcome that adversity, they can't work hard, they can't get a quality education, then somehow they're less successful and that's their fault. And I think it places the blame on the individual. So the question is, how much does obtaining an education fall on the individual compared to the education system and the social structures that sit around and supports that? So, in trying to simplify it down to explain it to a primary school student, you can use a running race analogy. If you're all starting on the start line and you race, then some people don't start together. You can start 10 meters behind, 20 meters behind. So they're working just as hard, but they're still not achieving, or they have to work that much harder to overcome that adversity. So it's a question of equity. Is that fair? So I think that analogy, it's very simplistic, but it's an easy way to sort of, I think, focus on the system, on structures, and move away from the discourse of individualizing it and focusing on individual deficits instead. So I think that's sort of something just picking up off, riffing off what Jane had to say.
Yeah, I agree. And Leanne?
Yeah, thanks, Verity. I think it's an interesting question, and obviously it's not true at all, as all of my panel co-panel members have stated. But I think it also is about how do we define smart. And we use a very Western baseline to define smart from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. And we know that there's multi-layered barriers for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to access higher education or education more broadly. And they're common to other groups, there's financial implications and school experiences, but there's also family and community responsibilities that's quite unique to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and also a big one is a sense of belonging, and particularly coming into a higher education. And so we find that that's probably one of our prominent challenges for students coming into higher education. They can be smart as academically smart, but they still don't feel that sense of belonging, and that they should be that they should be here in this environment. And so I suppose that comes to particularly universities providing environments and curriculum that is conducive to the values and experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. And recognising other challenges such as racism and discrimination, and that we that we have a zero tolerance to that, and that we don't just say it, that there's actions that back it up. I also think and I totally agree with the challenges that we have for our rural, regional and remote students. But I think government policies also need to consider the uniqueness of some of the challenges of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as well. And in an NAPTHINE report, or the report that was done a few years ago for rural, regional and remote, it stated that that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students had a higher attrition rate. Urban Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students had a higher attrition rate than very remote, low socioeconomic students, and yet, when the recent policies changed to the Job Ready Graduates package, they included demand-driven places for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander regional and remote students. But no matter how much we argued that, this is a need for all of our students, we're still having the argument. So I think there needs to be consideration for those multi-layered barriers, and what are we trying to achieve?
I'm glad you say that, Leanne, because in that same package, they also adjusted the way that equity funding was paid to universities, so that in this bizarre, perfect example was they prioritised rural and regional students essentially over urban students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So a university like the University of Western Sydney ended up losing the most of any university in Australia when it came to equity funding. And I think that was just madness.
And while we're and like, you know, another one of my that I harp on about is that while we use postcodes to define economic status, it's flawed, because, like, you know, we know that some of our most poverty-stricken communities reside in urban areas. And that's not taking away from the challenges from our communities in regional and remote areas either.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't have to be either or.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah. So Leanne, I'm going to come to you now to talk about your book, Talking Strong. So in this book, you explore the development of national education policies for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. And as part of it, you spoke with many leaders who worked to map a path for a positive educational future. And so what were some of the key takeaways from that book or that process?
Yeah, thanks, Verity. I loved putting the book together. I was really privileged to talk to so many wonderful past Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, past and present Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders. I mean, they continue to be our leaders. But, like, you know, there were some really key themes. And one of the questions that I asked them when I spoke to them was, what advice do you have for future leaders, educators, like, you know, our ambassadors of education? And there were definitely some key themes. One of them was inclusion of curriculum that builds an understanding and knowledge of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories, and not just around our challenges, but also around our successes and the deep knowledge that has been acquired over thousands of years. Because when we talk about Aboriginal histories, it always, like, you know, it hones in on the deficits of our history and not the strengths of our history. So that was one thing that came through very clear. Another one was Aboriginal-led decision making. And so the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, but also having respectful and reciprocal relationships with non-Aboriginal people in continuing to improve the educational outcomes. And also, because the thing about these leaders, they looked at education from early childhood through to higher education, and it was quite unique, and it still is unique. Like, you know, the government silos us so that we look at early childhood, or we look at school education, or we look at vocational education or higher education. It's all very, it's all very pocketed. But like public health, these are things that we should be looking at holistically, and that message came through really strong. The other message, the final message that I'll highlight was ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students are empowered to be true to themselves. And their identity as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. There was concern that we put a lot of effort into growing white fella capacity, as it was noted, but making sure that that isn't at the detriment of remembering where they came from, or who they are in their hearts. And I'll quote, like, you know, a really lovely one of the late Leanne Holt, who was like, you know, a key leader and elder within our communities, said to me that she cautioned that it's not just about the head, it's also about the heart. It's about the head and the heart. And she said, and the greatest journey sometimes is from the head to the heart. And I always reflect on that, because I think it's a really beautiful statement.
That is beautiful. Jane, I'm going to come to you, because I really like what Leanne had to say about the sort of continuum of education, the fact that, and she's exactly right, that we silo early childhood, silo primary, silo secondary, when in fact it is a continuum. So you've already talked a bit about how important the quality of education that a child receives early on, but can you elaborate on that in terms of the difference that makes as the child goes into primary, secondary, vocational, and sort of how it all comes together?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that resonated, Leanne, and what you were saying is connection to family and community as well, and country. So again, we sort of silo things, don't we? But for children really to have the best chances of thriving, it's education and yes, absolutely an education pathway the whole way, and thinking about it in that way, which is why so much work is happening in those sort of transitions, because we've artificially created these siloed systems. But certainly, I think there's a really key point in your question, Verity, and that's about quality. And it's about supporting all children to have access to appropriate high quality early childhood education and care. And we know why that's important. Most of the brain development for children occurs in those early years, particularly 0 to 3 for anyone who's had little children in their lives. And high quality education delivers sort of substantial and sustained impact. We know this because unfortunately we've seen what happens with low quality education. There have been countries that have scaled low quality systems and they've actually caused harm. So they've impacted early language skills or cognitive development and so on. It's only in high quality that you get the return. And we've got some beautiful examples in Australia. There's some beautiful First Nations examples. There's a great example in another one in the early years education program. There's got very clear evidence that if you support children in the early years with early childhood education and care at the right amount for them, it does vary for children, plus some family support, that in their work, children who came through sort of out-of-home care system, very vulnerable children who started behind their peers at IQ levels, after that work with the family and the provision of early childhood education and care, were entering on par with their peers to school. So we've got sort of programmatic evidence that this works. We've also got population level evidence. So we worked with PwC a few years ago on having a look at the return or what the impact of our year before school was, so that early education. And what we were able to show very, very clearly is that early childhood education puts students ahead at the start of primary school, and that benefit increases over time. And it was associated with approximately, and it's always tricky about these things, 14 additional NAPLAN points at year 3. And then, of course, higher scores at year 3 linked to better scores at year 9 and then on to graduation. But this is something that's not quite the education continuum. When we released that research, it got a lot of attention from parents, because what we were able to show the link between is children participating in early childhood education and their improved earnings when they got to work over time. But that is because of the education learning continuum that was put in place.
That's incredible. Improved earnings. I suppose that makes sense. You don't have to look after them for as long if they've got better earning potential. Chris, the percentage of regional Australians with a university degree, as we've been discussing, is half that of metropolitan areas. So let's talk about rural and regional students. What barriers do they particularly face? What barriers do their communities face when it comes to accessing university education in particular? But you can talk more broadly than that if you want.
Sure. I think it's an immensely complex question, but it often elicits a rather simplified response. And I think that's problematic. So there's obvious barriers. So the general, I guess, discourses around cost, distance, university infrastructure. These are the things that sort of permeate through all of these conversations and challenges, and through governments and universities as well. But I guess I would challenge that we probably need to look a little deeper than that. So, to use a stat in your question, Verity, 40% on average in the metropolitan areas of people have bachelor attainment, compared to 20% in regional areas. So that's half as much. But the point on that 20% is that's stagnated for 30 years or around 30 years. So it has not changed. And that's in the face of so many government and university interventions, things such as HEP, widening participation and school outreach, increased university infrastructure in regional Australia, policy mechanisms like demand-driven funding. These things have been effective for other equity groups, but not for regional communities. So the question for me, and that I constantly ask, and when this sort of topic comes up, is what's the through line for all of this? And for me, it's the conceptualization of higher education in Australia hasn't changed across those 30 years. These attempts have been about supporting individual students to change and to be able to fit the mold of higher education. And the point is, this isn't just about rural regional, this is about lots of different groups of people who have traditionally been excluded from higher education. So there's been no systemic shift, and universities and governments have essentially said change to fit our mold. So if we look at aspirations as an example, so much funding has been invested into nurturing and supporting aspirations of regional Australians for university. But research has shown in New South Wales Department of Education, and a recent study in South Australia shows that aspiration is actually high for students. They do have a high aspiration for university. The challenge comes in that transition space, in moving to university, be it their context that they live in or the barriers that they have. And that's the key around the barriers, is they have to change who they are and their identity and the community in which they live to fit the mould of higher education in Australia. And also, I guess in the front end of the question was, we haven't talked about community yet. It's always been about university and government intervention. Where is community in all of this? And so only now, recently, do we start to see that. And I think there has been good progress starting to be made around putting communities at the centre of challenging higher education for regional Australia. So, in my work, we put the community at its core. That's been the largest point of success. So I think, it's around barriers for regional people to access higher education are deeply embedded in that system. And my provocation is probably that often the discourse is simplified to cost, distance, aspiration. And while there's certainly challenges, if we truly want to address that gap and break from that stagnation of 20%, which has existed for 30 years, then we need to dig a lot deeper. And I think Leanne and Jane both highlighted the importance of education and community working together. That community is a key, because, it takes a village to raise a child, and that's the same in education. Yet for some reason in regional Australia especially, we've sort of excluded communities from the conversation around higher education and around universities. So I think that is the real core, that's sort of the core barrier that's driving a lot of this.
And that's really good insights there, Chris. And I'm going to come to you, Leanne, and I know we're talking higher education again, but considering what Chris has just said around that sort of lack of community engagement, but also it's almost higher education's, we know what mould you need to fit. And if you don't meet our exacting standards, you are clearly not for us. How that actually translates, particularly for first in family students that come to university. And do you think enough is being done? Like, what is your response to that? Is enough being done to actually help with that transition and recognise that not everything universities do are perfect?
Yeah, no, I think that there is a lot of room for improvement, and I think that understanding that a majority of our students are first in family, and so as Chris said, they're not lacking aspiration, which is what has been the focus for many years. The regional remote or the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander, they don't have high aspirations, and that's actually recent research to show that that's actually not true. It's whether their aspirations are supported from a school level. That's been a big challenge, and also about actually linking with there was also a lot of research on you can't be what you can't see. So we're looking at this year, we're developing a Indigenous outreach or Indigenous Pathways Academy, and we're linking industry partners in with that, so that they can so that we can link year 11 students with an industry in line with their aspiration, so that they actually can meet people that are in the professions that they're interested in, instead of it being a bit of a dream and it's here, but we're here and we need to try to swim to get to the other side, so that we can see what it's like over there. So trying to bridge some of that, so that that the relationships with those industries and professional areas can be developed a lot sooner, and so that while they're doing their year 12, they actually can be thinking well, I have this relationship with this legal firm or this engineering firm or this business firm or education or school or whatever, and I know people that have achieved this, and I know what I need to do. I know I've got mentors. So I suppose making it more realistic, but also definitely engaging the parents and all of those structures around the student in those conversations too, so that we know, I remember that when I first came into the university, and I was a prospective student advisor. So I go to schools, and I went to King's. I went to King's at a career fair. I was working for Newcastle at the time, and this boy said to me, he was in year 8 and he was helping carry the boxes in, and he said to me, "I'm coming to Newcastle." And I said, "Oh, are you?" I said, "What are you going to do at Newcastle?" He said, "I don't know." And I said, "All right." I said, "So why Newcastle?" "Oh, my dad went to Newcastle." To me, that showed what an influence parents have on their children's future pathways and aspirations. So it's so important that we engage community in these discussions, because they have so much influence, and they want to be able to provide that information. And if they don't know it, then that disempowers them as well. So and I know as a first in family myself, when I started, I hadn't stepped on a university campus until I came for my interview to work at a university, and never had considered university as an option. I was going to TAFE at night and working full time. I applied for the university because I was about to get married, and I knew that I could get maternity leave from working at a university. And it was a 12-month contract, and my father was saying to me, why? Why would you want to work at a university for? What good is that going to do you? And it's a 12-month contract. And so he had little understanding of what a university was, and he had his own perceptions. So I suppose it's changing those perceptions to show that universities are actually positive places for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, for example.
Yeah. Hugh, so we're partnering with the Human Rights Law Centre, and part of the reason why we're partnering on this is that we want to discuss the concept of education as a human right. So Hugh, my question to you is, do people have a right to education?
And the answer is yes and no. In preparing for today's talk, I had a look at the New South Wales Education Act, and it says, Section 4, the objects of the Act, the legislation says every child has the right to receive an education. And then you scroll through this long act and you get to the bottom at Section 127. It says, anything we said in the objects clause does not give any right to any civil cause of action. So on the one hand, the Parliament is promising this right to education. This is why we have this piece of legislation that sets up schools and registration and curriculum and all that stuff. And then on the other hand, it's saying, by the way, don't hold us accountable to this. We're not giving an individual to take legal action against us to enforce this right to education. And that's pretty much the state across Australia, with some exceptions. So the Australian government has promised under international law to comply with these really foundational treaties, the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which guarantees the right to education. Successive Australian governments have signed and ratified that. We report against it, we're scrutinised against that, but we have not embedded that right in Australian law. And that's what we're trying to change through an Australian Charter of Human Rights. And people who want to get behind that campaign can go to charterofrights.org.au, because we think that the Australian government should be held accountable to those promises that they've made internationally and to the Australian people to create a legally enforceable right to education. And things are changing. So in Victoria, where I'm based, here on Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, we have a Charter of Human Rights, but it's only focused on civil and political and cultural rights. It doesn't guarantee the right to health or the right to education or the right to housing. The ACT, the first jurisdiction in Australia to have a Human Rights Act or Charter, has a right to education in it, but it's a very limited right to education. Queensland then created their Human Rights Act in 2020 and said, we will have a right to education and it's legally enforceable. So they say every child has the right to access school education appropriate to their needs. So that is a binding, legally enforceable right. And it's early days in Queensland, but there have been complaints that have been brought applying that human right and saying that right is being breached. And when you look at some of the issues that Chris and Jane and Leanne are talking about, when you hear stories of children going through high school in remote and regional communities and coming out without functional literacy and numeracy through no fault of their own, they're not getting a decent education because of the postcode they grew up in or what's in their bank balance. That needs to change, and that's where a right to education can play a role, and it's why we see it as a fundamental part of a Charter of Rights.
So I'm going to come across to some of the audience questions now, because I think they flow. Some of the audience questions are also about rights and discrimination law, and I think it's quite a nice flow. The questions that are currently leading in the votes, and as I said, I'm taking the most popular questions. It's got a very long introduction. Essentially, the New South Wales government is currently considering Mark Latham's anti-trans kids bill, which would erase trans and gender diverse students in classrooms and schoolyards across New South Wales and silence discussion of LGBTQ issues more generally. The government response to an inquiry chaired by Mark Latham, but endorsed by all 3 government MLCs and 1 of 2 Labor MLCs, is due by 7th of March. So that's the introduction. The question is, how can we protect and promote the right to education for everyone when LGBTQ kids can be lawfully discriminated against by religious schools under New South Wales and Commonwealth law, and are largely written out of the National Health and Physical Education curriculum and subject to discriminatory attacks like Mark Latham's anti-trans kids bill? So I might actually throw to you first, Hugh, because you will probably have views particularly around the anti-discrimination element of it.
Yes, and the right to education, when you look at international law and this UN treaty and you look at how that's been interpreted by the expert committee, which talks about how that right is realised, of course it has to be accessible and adaptable. It has to, your education system has to respond to the diverse needs of different communities across your country. And that means LGBTIQ plus kids, that means kids from remote areas, Aboriginal kids, kids from multi-faith backgrounds, kids of all diverse communities and areas. And that right then intersects with your equality rights. And we do have imperfect, but we do have protections against discrimination on the grounds of various attributes in Australia, race, religion, gender, etc. And what we've had is a very toxic debate in the federal parliament recently, an awful debate, particularly for trans kids and their families, as their worth is sort of debated in federal parliament and the national media. And it underscores the need to do more to protect those kids. So the Prime Minister promised in 2018 to protect some kids from discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools, but didn't go as far as protecting trans kids. And that's a gap. It needs to change. And there is a constant culture war here where people like Mark Latham are trying to chip away at those protections. But inch by inch, those protections are being strengthened. In Victoria, we've just had laws that strengthen the protection of against discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools for both students and staff in the schools as well. And so the right to education, critical human right, a gateway to protecting other rights. If you have a good education, as Jane said, early childhood education is a pathway to employment, health, housing, all of the things we know create a decent, dignified life. So getting it right in education is so critical to other human rights and equality in that education, and making sure children aren't discriminated against unfairly because of who they are is fundamental to that.
And Leanne, I just thought I would just follow up, because I know you said something earlier about the importance of belonging, right? So for students to actually succeed in an education setting, they need to have this sense of belonging. And I'm assuming, I don't know if you have anything to add, particularly to the LGBTQ example, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the importance of that sense of belonging.
Yeah, I think it's horrific. I think anything that has anti and kids in the one sentence is flawed. I think that I think sometimes we get caught up in looking at groupings, like, you know, looking at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, LGBTIQ, like, you know, and looking at that as equity initiatives, instead of just looking at it as good business and good practice. And, like, you know, I sort of say the employment and the education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students is not an equity initiative. It's a value add proposition. It's a value add proposition to not just our university, but to our societies. And the sooner that our governments realise the value in our diversity, in all the aspects of our diversity, the sooner that, like, you know, we can start making good policies and making good future decisions for our society. So, like, you know, from my perspective, like, you know, it's common sense, but, like, you know, who puts government and common sense in one sentence?
Or electioneering in one sentence, and common sense. Jane and Chris, do you have anything to add to that question?
Can I add something? Because I mean, I really agree with Leanne on this. And I think one of the things that strikes me in this, you can't slice and dice rights, right? And it kind of comes back and reminds me of a conversation I actually had, weirdly, with a business leader at the World Economic Forum. And we were talking about, Leanne, you talked about all those skills, like good business, right? And all those skills employers need and things like that. And this global business leader was telling me how they were running empathy labs for their employees because they've got this decrease in empathy. Now, empathy is built in the early years. That ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, you know, that ability to be with lots of different people is built early. You can't retrofit it later, right? And to your point, Leanne, we grow good humans through our education system, don't we? And saying these types of humans are not able to access this kind of education is not the way it works for a good, healthy citizenship. Yeah.
Totally. So the next question I'm going to ask is from Pam Rowley. Rita, I recognise you've also asked a question around Disability Discrimination Act, so we'll come back to that. But I thought Pam's was interesting. Is the right to an education a matter of providing access to education, or is it about successfully gaining an education? So, Hugh, do you want to tell us the technical response to that? And then I might open it up to the floor.
It's the way it's expressed under international law is it's an obligation on governments to provide, for example, free primary school education, and then that's been interpreted to mean education of a decent quality. So it's not enough to set up substandard education programs with gaps in it that don't address the needs of communities that are inaccessible to people from different areas. And so the obligation on governments is to provide quality education for people from diverse needs.
Does anyone else want to add to Hugh's comment? Oh, Chris.
I'm happy to. It's interesting in the regional context, often regional communities will get something in terms of the university or schools and then acknowledge, okay, well, now you have access to education. So the question of quality doesn't often come into it, or even access of opportunity. So in the higher education space, you know, a small regional campus might pop up and only offer 3 or 4 degrees. So the question could be asked, is that genuine access when in a metropolitan centre you can access a whole plethora of choice? So that issue around choice and quality, I think often doesn't come into it. And just on Leanne's point earlier around, I guess, the sense of belonging and categorisation, I think it's counterproductive when we try and single out people using categories. You know, I can only speak from my context in regional Australia, and it is problematic and it sets us back. And it's, you know, with sort of intersectionality has been stitched through a lot of people's comments through this, and that sort of nuance needs to be picked up in the and a discussion. It needs to be picked up and acknowledged in the debate. It's an immutable fact that is the challenge that we're looking at here, not these simplistic categorizations and trying to simplify things down.
Agree. Now, Rita's asked a couple of questions around disability discrimination, which of course is a big issue in education. So I think I'll just go with the first one because it's nice and broad, which is how do we change the Disability Discrimination Act to fully honour the right to education and the right to security of person? Again, I'm going to go to Hugh because it's a Discrimination Act question, but then I'll open it up to the floor.
And there's people who are much more expert at me than this particular topic. And when you look at Australia's obligations under, for example, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, there are specific obligations that Australia has signed up to provide education that is inclusive. So not having separate systems for children with a disability, but to have genuine opportunities for children with disability to participate in education in mainstream schools. And the committee, every time that Australia is periodically reviewed, criticises Australia for failing to properly meet its obligations under that treaty. And one of the ways that Australia should be meeting those obligations is through effective anti-discrimination law. That discrimination law is well documented as being useful but flawed in the sense that it often puts the onus on changing these systems on individual people who bear enormous stress and cost risk and the like to challenge the exclusion at great cost to themselves. And so there is a need to modernise anti-discrimination law, particularly for people with disability and inclusion in schools. There's a need to for Australia to properly live up to its promise under international law to provide systems of education that are inclusive for people with disabilities.
Does anyone else want to add to that? That's all right. We'll move to the next. So we've got a beautiful comment from Jennifer. You can read that yourself. She's saying what a great panel it is and how much she appreciates it. So thank you. We might now go to, my thing's now moving because there's people are voting. So it's going up and down the screen. I might just quickly go. I want to ask Stephen Masters' question because he has asked the very good question around why Australia doesn't have a Bill of Rights in relation to education, but I thought we might conclude on that because that's a nice conclusion. So we'll have enough time to ask one more from Natasha Skye, and she talks about the Gonski funding. So there was a recent article in the Sydney Morning Herald. In the 20 years to 2020, government funding to government schools has grown by 53%, while funding to private schools has grown by 98.7%. How do we fix this funding model to ensure our most vulnerable and disadvantaged students, many of whom attend public schools, are not left behind? And in the wake of COVID disruption, how do we plan for the impact of the lost years of learning for our kids, which I think is a big issue that a number of us are grappling with at the moment. Jane, do you have any views around that?
I do, because there is no needs-based funding in early childhood education. And it's a massive systemic issue that means that children who most need early childhood education are actually not able to access it. So I'll pass to the colleagues on the later years, but I just want to make that point. We don't have it in Australia for children in their early years.
Yeah. Leanne or Chris, do you have any issues, things you want to raise about the funding model? No, that's all right. I mean,
I'll just add one thing, because later on Natasha talks about
cost of universities.
Yeah, cost of universities. And it was one thing that I put a lot of concentration on last year, again, with the changes to the graduate job ready package, and that where they changed the student contribution rates for particularly humanities, and made it a lot higher. And obviously my focus was for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, who the vast majority do units within humanities. And so it's straight away that raised their debt. But the actual basis of putting a financial policy in line with trying to influence students to pick up units in STEM or in areas that they want to shift students to, I think goes against all students' human rights to start with. Like, you know, I think it's ridiculous that there could be a financial policy put in place that actually is, the basis of it is to try to actually make people do something that, like, you know, they may not be their dream or their aspiration based on being financially better off when they complete university. Again, it's
and also presumably
beyond me.
It doesn't work if you force a whole lot of poets to study science. You'll just have scientists who aren't very.
All I could see was a whole a large percentage of our students coming out of university with a higher debt.
And Chris, I might throw, I'll throw to you on the issue of the cost of university, because I'm sure you'll have views on that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's disproportionately impacts, all those, the Job Ready Graduates package disproportionately impacts sort of people who have been excluded from higher education. So if you take regional students, for example, and the notion of, that Leanne was talking about around funneling people into degrees and courses, what's magnified in a regional community. Because what the young people especially see, or even mature age and non-traditional students see, is that connection to industry. So if the government is telling them to go down a specific path, providing financial incentives to do so, it really sort of surreptitiously pushes them, and it influences them far more than somebody who comes from a more privileged background who has the idea of choice. And sort of circling back to the first in family component as well, we're looking at first in family students. Often universities is unknown. So when you have these pressures and it's pushing them in one direction, I don't think it's in the best interest of the individual. It's something that makes me deeply uncomfortable. And I just want to emphasize what Leanne said, how important that is for regional communities, because we see it and the communities pick up that language and pick up those financial incentives, and it can really shape in a negative way what happens on the ground.
Yeah, and can I just add very quickly? I'm just really agreeing with Chris, because a lot of our students, and not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, but students that have had challenges, like, you know, accessing education, they choose those careers because they can relate to them, and they feel that is the way that they can go back and give back to community and make it a better place. So, like, you know, to undervalue that contribution that they want to make is it just doesn't make sense.
So, Hugh.
I was just going to add to that, because just hearing that discussion this morning, I read there's a committee in the federal parliament that scrutinises legislation for compliance with international human rights standards, including the right to education. So this morning I read the committee's report on that Jobs Ready legislation that increased the cost for some students. And the committee asked questions of the minister and said, and the way the right to education works in international law is it says Australia has to progressively realise this right of and move towards, as efficiently and as expeditiously as possible, free higher education. So how can you justify that against increasing the cost for some people? And the government said, we're not increasing, no one needs to pay up front. So they kept pointing to this loan scheme, ignoring the fact that people's debts under that loan scheme were going to be hugely increased depending on what they chose to study. And the committee said what this is, it appears to be a retrograde measure, which is going back on the promise the Australian government has made, breaching the right to education. And the minister obviously didn't agree with that. And that was a nice academic debate that happened in this committee in federal parliament that no one really picked up on in the mainstream media, and put very little pressure on the government whatsoever. So it underscores why it's important to have legally enforceable rights to actually make sure governments take these obligations seriously, to live up to the promises they have made to provide a right and realise a right to education for all people across the country.
All right, so I'm mindful of the time. We've got 5 minutes left. So what I want to do now is just get the panel to quickly give me a response around what do you see as the solutions in your area to make the right to education a reality for everyone, right? So including the people and communities you're engaged with. So what do you see as the solutions? And I'm going to ask Jane first.
Thanks, Verity. Well, for us, it would be the right to at least 2 years of high quality education and care for all children, regardless of your parent's employment status, and in fact, targeted support for those children who need access to quality education and care that are at the moment being excluded. And I think the other thing is, picking up on Leanne and Chris's conversation about first in family, investing in the early childhood education and care workforce. The educators and teachers, they have the most impact on the outcomes for children. And we have a workforce that are often first in family. They're upskilling from diplomas to teachers, and we need to invest, because they're the ones who, to your point, Chris, will go back into regional communities, go back into areas, and then grow the next generation of learners.
Leanne.
Yeah.
Solution to make it a reality.
I agree with Jane. I also think that we need to go back to looking at education holistically. As we discussed before, community driven and community voice, and Chris talked about this too. We need to be centering our communities around what we're doing in education and how we're making education accessible and conducive to the success of our students, and also systemizing things so that they're not just we get this short-term funding that there's wonderful things that happen, but unless we embed that within the systems and structures of our institutions and our broader government policies, then they disappear, and we don't actually get to see the fruition of the long-term impacts that they can make.
And Chris, what do you see as the solutions?
I agree around putting the community at the centre of it. And focusing on the systems. So moving away from all of the conversations we've had around individualising and that sort of almost blame on an individual who have come from, traditionally excluded backgrounds. I think that is the key. And it's interesting in this conversation, drawing the through line between early childhood right through to higher education, and being able to chip away at all the different structures along, that life cycle of a learner's journey, I think is imperative. So structures is number one thing, and then integrating across all the different levels.
Couldn't agree more. All right, so I'm going to let Hugh have the last word. He's the partner after all, and I'm just going to give you a two-parter, Hugh, because I thought
sure.
Stephen's okay. So the first bit of the question is, in light of what you've heard today, how would an Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms make a difference? But I thought you could also address Stephen Masters' question where he said, why hasn't Australia managed to have a Bill of Rights, which will include the right to a education? And then we'll conclude with your comments.
No pressure. We've had various attempts where we've come close to getting a national or Australian Charter of Human Rights, Bill of Rights, Human Rights Act. We call it a Charter of Human Rights. And the last closest attempt was 2009. There was a national consultation led by Father Frank Brennan, I think the biggest ever consultation done nationally at the time. Huge support for stronger human rights protections and stronger human rights education, by the way, was their number one recommendation. But for a range of political reasons, the Rudd government didn't implement that recommendation around establishing a Human Rights Act or a Charter of Human Rights. And so that's why we have a campaign right now to try and change that. And so people who care about these issues, please do get behind the campaign, charterofrights.org.au, and help us to achieve this. And when you actually ask Australian people which human rights are the most important, there isn't a hierarchy of rights, by the way, but when you ask people what they think are the most important, they say education, health, housing, food, water, these fundamental economic and social rights that governments are typically reluctant to actually live up to those promises. And so we can change that by saying you have a legally enforceable right in a Charter of Rights to an education, to a right to health, the highest attainable standard of health, to a roof over your head, to food, to water. These are things that are fundamental to living a decent, dignified life, and we should make them legally enforceable in Australia. A Charter of Rights would require governments to properly consider those human rights when they're making decisions and delivering services, and to act compatibly with them, to comply with those human rights obligations. It would give people the power to take action if their human rights were breached. And the experience from, Australia is the only Western democracy without a national charter of rights or equivalent. And the experience from comparable countries is that it works. They work to prevent human rights problems from happening down the track. They focus the attention of governments when they're making decisions around policies, when they're delivering services, to think about the impact of government action on humans and their lives. And but to be taken seriously, they need to be legally enforceable obligations. So that's our vision. We want to see a charter of rights. We want to see it with economic and social rights, like the right to education, embedded in it, to give people a legally enforceable right to have a decent education, regardless of where they live or what's in their bank balance.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hugh, and thank you to all our panelists today. I really enjoyed that discussion. It was great. So thank you for giving us your time. And thank you also to everyone who joined us. It was really wonderful having your participation and your wonderful questions. And we'll see you next time. See you, everybody.
Thank you, Verity. Thanks, everyone.